Hello, do you know there's a relationship between fractions, decimals, ratios, and percentage? In a fraction, the top and the bottom numbers are separated by a line, and that line is called vinculum. Let's learn more about fractions. My name is Kingsley Linus. There are a few things I would like you to learn by the end of this class. First, to define fractions, ratios, decimals, and percentages. Secondly, conversions involving fractions, ratios, decimals, and percentages. And lastly, to solve quantitative reasoning problems related to conversion of fractions to ratios, decimals, and percentages. Earlier on, I mentioned there is a relationship between fractions, decimals, ratios, and percentages. Now, a number can be represented in any of these. The major difference is that one of them would be more appropriate in a given situation. For example, the fraction 2/3 can be expressed as a ratio 2:3. In decimal, it can be expressed as 0.67, while in percentage, we can represent the same number as 67%. Now, let's talk about fractions. A fraction is simply a part of a whole, meaning when we have a whole and we choose to take some part of that whole or a piece from that whole, this is simply what a fraction is. Usually, a fraction has three parts: the top number, which is called the numerator, the bottom number, which is called the denominator, and the line that separates the top and the bottom number, called vinculum. Here we have a pizza that has been split into 8 parts. Now, if we take 4 out of that 8 parts, that is half of the whole pizza, and we represent that as 1/2. 1/2 stands for half. Having seen what a fraction is, let us learn about ratios. A ratio is simply the relationship or the comparison between two quantities of similar magnitude. Now, usually, ratios can be written as fractions as well. So ratios behave like fractions. Usually, ratios are written as two numbers separated by a colon. So, this can be read as 3:7. And the relationship between the number 3 and 7 is such that the second number contains the first number a certain number of times. To better understand ratios, we have an illustration. It says, suppose that 2 school bags cost 3,000 naira and 5,000 naira. The ratio of their prices is 3,000 ratio 5,000. Now you see, we can represent this ratio as a fraction 3,000 over 5,000, and we can reduce that by cancelling out the zeros to 3 and 5. You see, 3/5 as a fraction is the same thing as 3:5. Therefore, both parts of a ratio may be multiplied or divided by the same number. It is also important that we always express our ratios in their simplest or lowest form. We have an example, still talking about ratios. If 25 oranges are shared between 2 people, person A receives 15 oranges and person B receives 10 oranges. Person A's share is 3/5 of the whole 25, and person B's share is 2/5 of the whole 25. Now, this is person A ratio person B. First, 3/5 of 25 is 15, and 2/5, that simply means 3 times 5 and 2 times 5. So 3 times 5 is 15 and 2 times 5 is 10. Now we can reduce 15 and 10 to 3:2. So having 3:2 means that we have successfully represented this question in a ratio, or the shares of oranges that each person gets, we have been able to represent it in a ratio. So 3:2 represents the number of shares these individuals get. Now, let's talk about decimal numbers. Decimal numbers came from whole numbers. Usually, we recognize a decimal number by a decimal point that separates the whole number part from the fractional parts. The word decimal is gotten from a Latin word decim, meaning 10. Having learnt about fractions, decimals, and ratios, let's learn how we can convert decimals to fractions. To change a decimal to a fraction, simply write the decimal as a fraction with a denominator which is a power of 10, and simplify if possible. Now we have an example that says, change the following to fractions in their lowest term. We have 0.55 and we have 0.875. Now 0.55, for us to write it as a fraction, we'll look at the number of places that our decimal will have to go. So we'll divide, or we'll give it a denominator that has the same number of zeros, that is 100. So 55 over 100 is the same as 0.55. Now, recall also when we are talking about ratios that I mentioned you can divide the denominator and the numerator by the same number to express a number as a ratio. The same thing applies here in a fraction. So we can divide 55 by 5 and 100 by 5. And when we do that, we would have 11 over 20. This is the simplest form we can have 0.55 represented as a fraction. Now let's look at the second example, 0.875. Now, just like we did in the first one, we check the number of times we will have to move our decimal through the number. Now that is 3 times, so we are going to divide by 1000. So 875 over 1000 is the same as 0.875. Now we can go ahead to do our division. Well, for me, I've chosen to use 125 to divide, but if this looks so big for you, you can start dividing with 5 until you get to your simplest form. But for me, I've chosen to use 125. So 125 into 875 gives me 7. And 125 into 1000 gives me 8. And this is my simplest form. So 0.875 as decimal can be represented as 7 over 8 as a fraction. Now, we are doing something different. We converted from decimal to fraction. This time around, we are converting from fraction to decimal. To do that, we simply divide the numerator of the fraction by its denominator. That is not difficult, I guess. We have some examples. The instruction says change the fractions to decimals. We have 12 over 25 and 1 over 3. Now, as easy as it is, we need to divide the numerator by the denominator. For the first example, we have 12 divided by 25. Well, however you choose to go about your division, you can use a calculator, you can choose to do long division. When you divide 12 by 25, you would have 0.48. Now, you realize that we call this a terminating decimal because there are no further numbers beyond this point. Now, to the second example, 1 over 3, we divide 1 by 3. Our answer will be 0.33333, and the list continues. In this case, we have a recurring decimal. So what you do is you just take the simplest form possible, 0.3. So 1 over 3 as a fraction can be represented by 0.3 in decimal. Having learned about how to convert from decimal to fraction and vice versa, let's learn about percentages. Whenever you come across percentage or percent, simply put, it means per 100, or it simply means such a number has a denominator of 100. This is the symbol for percentage. Now, when we have a number like 25%, it simply means 25 over 100. Now, let's see how we can change percentage to a fraction. To do that, you simply divide the percent by 100. If the percent is not a whole number, then multiply both top and bottom by 10 for every number after the decimal points. Finally, reduce the fraction to the smallest. Now we have examples. The instruction says change the following to fractions. First, we have 92%, and secondly, we have 5 whole number 2 over 3%. For 92%, we simply divide 92 by 100, and that gives us 0.92. 0.92 is a decimal fraction, but we actually need a common fraction. So, from 92 over 100, we have to reduce the number rather than dividing out. How do we do that? We can start with the number 2. 2 into 92 gives us 46. And 2 into 100 gives us 50. 2 into 46 gives us 23. 2 into 50 gives us 25. So that is the limit, or that is the lowest point we can get to. So our common fraction to represent 92% is 23 over 25. For our second example, we have a mixed fraction, 5 whole number 2 over 3%. Now we must first convert it to an improper fraction. We multiply 3 by 5, that gives us 15, plus 2. So we have 17 over 3%. Now the next step is to divide 17 over 3 by 100. Whenever you have a fraction divided by another number, the first thing to do is to see the number under as another fraction. So we have 100 over 1. To make the work easier, rather than dividing, we'll multiply. And then in this situation, our 100 over 1 becomes 1 over 100. So we multiply 17 over 3 by 1 over 100. When we do that, we would have 17 over 300. Now, if you look at 17 over 300, we do not have any number that can go into both the numerator and our denominator. So we leave our answer that way. So 5 whole number 2 over 3% represented as a fraction is 17 over 300. Having converted from percentage to fraction, let's see fraction to percentage. To do this, we simply divide the top of the fraction by the bottom, then multiply the fraction by 100. Our example says, change the following fractions to percentage. We have 5 over 6 and 3 over 4. So, we divide the top by the bottom. That means 5 divided by 6 multiplied by 100. And when we divide 5 by 6, we get 0.83, and we multiply by 100. To multiply by 100 is quite easy. You can simply move your decimal point, the number of zeros we have. So that gives us 83%. To the second example, where we have 3 over 4. So as usual, 3 divided by 4 multiplied by 100. 3 divided by 4 is 0.75 multiplied by 100, and that gives us 75%. It's time to do it yourself. Having learnt all the conversions, I'd like you to pause the video and try out these exercises. I'm sure you are done. The correct answers to these questions are 0.89, 11 over 20, 10%, and 32 over 25. If these were your answers, you are correct. The last objective of this lesson is to solve quantitative reasoning problems related to conversion of fractions, ratios, decimals, and percentages. Recall that numbers can be expressed as fraction, decimal, percent, and ratio. These samples help us to see the relationship between fractions, ratios, decimals, and percentages. First, we have 5 over 8 as a fraction. Now, to find the decimal equivalence, we simply divide the numerator 5 by 8. Now, however means you do that, either using a calculator or doing the long division method, you would have 0.625 as your answer. Now, to convert 0.625 to percentage, you simply multiply by 100. So when we multiply 0.625 by 100, it gives us 6.25%. Now, if you also recall, I made mention that fractions and ratios are the same. So 5 over 8 is the same as 5 ratio 8. Now, these two samples follow the same method. So you go about them the same method. And I believe it's clear enough. The first position for fraction, the second for decimal, this for ratio, and this for percentage. Having seen those samples, you have some exercises to practice with. So do well at this point to pause the video and try them yourself. I'm sure you are done. The correct answer to exercise A is 0.57. The correct answer to exercise B is 29 ratio 200. The correct answer to exercise C is 11.1%. And the correct answer to exercise D is 5 over 6. If these were your answers, you are correct. Having come to this point in this lesson, here is where we draw the curtains. But before you go, let's look at a summary of all we've learned. First, we learned that a fraction explains how many parts of a whole there are. Fractions are usually written as two numbers, a top number called the numerator and a bottom number called denominator, both separated by a line called vinculum. Secondly, we learned that a ratio is a way we can mathematically show the relationship between two quantities by comparing them. Moving on, we learned that decimal numbers are one way of representing fractions, ratios, and percents. Decimal means 10. Next, the term percent is simply another name for hundredths. Percent means per 100. And lastly, we learned that ratios, decimals, and percentages are related to fractions, and they can all be expressed as fractions. Now, let's try out some test questions. The first question says, change the following fraction to a decimal. The fraction is 17 over 43. Option A, 0.395. Option B, 0.482. Option C, 0.277. Or option D, 0.418. The correct answer is option A, 0.395. The second question says 67% is the same as the following except dash. Option A, 0.67. Option B, 2 ratio 3. Option C, 6 over 7. Or option D, 2 over 3. The answer to this question is option C, 6/7. Here is where we come to the end of this lesson. I'm sure you had a nice time. See you again in another mathematics lesson. Bye-bye.